Okay. I'm Irina Busygina, and I'm going to chair this session. And we start this session with a 10 minutes delay, according to our program. So I strongly ask, very strongly ask all the fantastic our four presenters to stick to 10 minutes time. So we would have enough time for questions and answers, and hopefully for 2 rounds of those. And this session will be devoted, it will be something different. It will be devoted to Russia and the Global South. This topic, it's a lot of interest to this particular topic, how Russia is doing and what Russia is doing in the Global South. And without any delay, I will pass the floor to our first presenter. And this is Ivan Klisch from the International Center for Defense and Security. Please, Ivan.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes. So, hello, thank you for being today in this panel. Thank you for making me part of this exciting event. I will be talking about the Russian idea of multipolarity. This is based on an upcoming monograph I'm writing now. It's under review with the title Russia and the Global South. So, of course, this is a very large topic with a very ambitious scope. Depending on how you define the Global South, it could be up to 140 countries. So I try to narrow that down. Instead of cutting down the countries, I try to narrow it down, cutting down on the ideas, and I focus on the idea of multipolarity. So I will be reading from here. So in a way, the question I try to tackle is, why has Moscow engaged the so-called Global South since 1991? I don't pretend to give a comprehensive answer. I just want to add one element to it, which is, let's say, the role of ideas. My background is in philosophy, so I err towards thinking of concepts and ideas. And I think when it comes to Russia's engagements with the broader world, the role of ideas is sometimes under scrutinized. My underlying hypothesis is that by engaging the Global South, Russia is not only articulating a great power foreign policy, but also acting based on ideas and not only on cost-benefit analysis. At a glance, the foreign policy of a great power and the normative outlook in international affairs are incommensurable with one another, because after all, external affairs are often either values-based or realpolitik. To overcome this dilemma, I rely on the framework of grand strategy. I particularly narrowed down even further based on Nina Silov's seminal article on the 3 meanings of grand strategy. These are a grand plan, which documents a strategy step by step, offers some sort of actual means and ends. A grand behavior, which is an outside-in perspective, which attempts to identify what is that pattern of behavior, and a grand principle, which is a set of overarching ideas as a form of ideas that gauge state behavior, acting as and this is an inside-out perspective. I opt for this later one, meaning that I also lean on the debate on Russia's state behavior as being more agenda-driven. And I approach it with an interpretivist methodology. The context is Russia's engagements with the Global South have been often analyzed from 2 points of view, either the regional impact and the impact of regional engagements in Russia's confrontation with the West. So these are examples of the literature I cite. A third point of view can be added, which is that of the countries of the Global South, the regions themselves, often analyzing the trade-offs of engaging Russia according to their own parameters. I draw from all these works in the literature, but what I ambition to bring into the debate is to bring in the global perspective back in and to bring in the role of ideas, like I mentioned at the start. Methodology, I will just skip this, and I will be happy to speak about it later. So this is a very kind of complex slide, so bear with me. I will simply narrate what I attempt to describe here. So what are Russia's grand strategy principles as articulated? Russia sees itself as a major power. This has been a leitmotif in Russian foreign policy since 1991, and that is reflected in opinion polling since the 1990s. The sense of great power status is then articulated into a messianic outlook, a regional entitlement, and a global foreign policy. Indeed, like the Cold War, Moscow's approach to international relations reflects a global view rather than a compartmentalized regional outlook. The name of this global view back in the Cold War was socialism, or the fight against imperialism. Today, we tend to think of Russia as an aspiring great power whose core interests lie in Europe, in the so-called former Soviet space. Yet Russia's interest in these regions is part of a broader global perspective on international affairs. The name of this perspective is multipolarity, the discourse. Namely, Moscow sees major powers as entitled to spheres of influence. Within these spheres of influence, the major powers are the only truly sovereign states and are brokers not only of regional politics, but also of normative frameworks. In other words, Russia rejects the universal notion of rights, holding the right of so-called civilizations to organize life according to their own notions of human rights. In international affairs, major powers are what matters, and institutions such as the United Nations are but the arena for major powers to bargain with one another. The Global South is essential in this narrative, as it is a site where rising powers are emerging. These emerging powers are thus meant to coalesce with Russia and constrain the West and bring about a multipolar order as opposed to the unipolar world that the West is attempting to uphold. This is how the notion of multipolarity is both descriptive and normative. Russia's mission is thus to pursue this vision of international affairs. This is where the specific means at the disposal of this grand strategy become relevant. Close to home, Russia's policies in the former Soviet space are meant to enact Russia's authority over its own power pole, including on matters of human rights and cultural identity. And the idea of the Russian world and all the accompanying so-called soft power instruments carry this notion with them. Multilateral organizations also play an important role in implementing the multipolarity grand strategy. The coalition with the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the BRICS, now BRICS Plus countries, also reflect these core features of the multipolarity narrative, especially that of emerging powers coalescing to restrain the West. The partnership with China in particular in these organizations is important as it places Russia, a major but not top economy, next to China as the second or first largest economy in the world, depending on the measures. The Commonwealth of Independent States and the CSTO also reflect ambition to assert Moscow's authority and to coalesce it institutionally. Further afield, under the notion that might guarantees sovereignty, Moscow's defense and security cooperation with authoritarian partners across the world gains a new dimension. Russia's arms exports, Wagner deployments, and the sheltering of authoritarian juntas is thus not only about diffused influence or just to displace the West, but it is meant to build multipolarity, namely to help countries overcome the unipolar world order, diversify their partnerships, and guarantee their sovereignty under the narrow definition that Russia understands it. This outlook is also reflected in the strategic communications and in some of its diplomacy. The cases of Russian support for anti-LGBT legislation across the world, this was often articulated in opposition to so-called Western values. These are common talking points in Russian public diplomacy across the world in various different means. Finally, Russian messianism has found a new expression. Russia's role in the emerging multipolar world is to sacrifice itself in the fight against Western unipolarity by directly confronting NATO. It just so happens that this confrontation takes place in Syria and Ukraine and other theaters. This elaborate argumentation ends up justifying the atrocities of Russia's aggression against Ukraine and war in Syria, and it is upheld by the Kremlin and others as harbingers of a supposedly more just world order. To sum up, Russia's global great power grand strategy is articulated by the grand principle of multipolarity. This principle reflects concerns about regime security and the legitimacy of illiberal governments in the contemporary world, as well as a concern over Russia's status among states. This principle is reflected in Russian foreign policy in different ways, including soft power instruments, regional organizations, traditional diplomacy, to defense and security cooperation and armed intervention, be it overt and covert. So indeed, kind of encompassing all the spheres of grand strategy. The narrative also reflects a zero-sum view of international affairs, where major powers ought to rule supreme. International organizations serve as either bargaining tables or as instruments of influence, and where universal notions of rights are impossible. Finally, and this is kind of an appendix to this narrative, the narrative of multipolarity has an obscurantist element to it as well. By denying the possibility of universal values and human rights, Russia upholds its own illegitimate system of government, as well as a confrontational narrative against the West that partners across the world are invited to embrace. So that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Juan. Very interesting about multipolarity. And Lukáš, now the floor is to Lukáš, Institut de Recherche Stratégique de l'École Militaire.
No, that was perfect. That was
Oh, really? Thank you.
as far as I am also not a French native speaker, so as far as I can tell, that was flawless. Where? All right. Can you guys hear me all right? Is that okay? Cool. First of all, thank you to GW for inviting me to speak at this fantastic conference. This presentation is based on a recent research paper of mine, which is available on the IRSEM website in case you're interested. I'd like to do 3 things in this presentation. First, I want to quickly review Russia's approach to the Arctic and how the war against Ukraine has impacted it. Second, I'd like to challenge the very common narrative that cooperation with China is now the defining feature of Russia's Arctic strategy, or that Russia and China have established some kind of Arctic alliance. And thirdly, I want to discuss to what extent the essence of Russia's Arctic strategy now lies in cooperation with non-Arctic states across the entire so-called global south. But maybe let's set the ground first. I know that I'm speaking to a specialist audience, so I'm probably preaching to the choir, but I still wanted to start with a couple of data points that I think illustrate quite nicely why it's important to continue studying developments in the Russian Arctic. As a reminder, Russia's Arctic is home to about 1%, 1.3% of the country's population, but it generates anywhere between 10 and 15% of Russian GDP, as well as 25% of Russian exports. And those shares will continue to grow. In 2020, 80% of Russia's natural gas and 17% of its oil were already produced in the Arctic. But American geologists have estimated that Russia's Arctic continental shelf contains more than 85.1 trillion cubic meters of undiscovered natural gas and 17.3 billion tons of oil in addition to that, and that's about 65 to 70% of Russia's officially undiscovered hydrocarbons. So on balance, as long as the Russian economy remains dependent on the export of natural resources, so probably forever, the Arctic will remain crucial for Moscow, especially from a financial and developmental point of view. And because of the importance of the Arctic for Russia's economy, its state budget, and by proxy also the financing of the war in Ukraine, companies in the region have for a very long time already been targeted by Western sanctions. To meet its development goals for the Arctic regardless, Russia has tried to sell its Arctic oil and gas to client states beyond Europe, but also to replace lost investments from the West. Those investments are really important because if no money comes into the Arctic territories and sanctioned technology is not successfully substituted, Russia will not be able to realize its Arctic energy extraction projects and therefore also not be able to salvage its national business model. So after the annexation of Crimea in 2014, Russia's preferred business partner in the Arctic was China. China has wanted for itself an independent role in the Arctic since about 2007, but until 2013, when China was admitted to the Arctic Council as an observer state, Russia was opposed to allowing for any role whatsoever of China or other non-Arctic states in the region. So why did the Russian government change its view on China's Arctic ambitions in 2013 and then allowed for China to develop a more independent posture in the Arctic? There are a few reasons, but I think personally that one of them is key, and that's pressure from Rosneft and other Russian energy conglomerates. Because in 2013 already, the diminishing long-term demand in Russia's main energy markets in Europe and the comparative attractiveness of East Asian growth markets set the tone for the decision-making of people like Igor Sich. Quite some time before Putin's mantra of the Pavarot na Vostok was adopted officially. So support for China's Arctic Council mission in 2013 was a result of pressure from energy executives. It was a concession of sorts by Russia to China to pave the way for improved energy cooperation. And it worked, because after 2013, and especially in 2014 after Crimea, energy ties between Russia and China in the Arctic multiplied, with two big Chinese investments in Russian Arctic energy projects right next to one another. I added a map over there to my slide. And also Chinese investments that were announced for port infrastructure along the Northern Sea Route, which is a planned shipping route along the Arctic coastlines of Russia. And as a result of those investments, China became the biggest foreign economic player in the Russian Arctic. This solidified the material basis of China's Arctic ambitions. And I think that only with its presence above the Arctic Circle, strengthened via the Russian Arctic, China was really able to define polar interests for itself and to cast itself as a near-Arctic state, which it did in an Arctic white paper that the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs published in 2018. But, of course, China's pursuit of its interest in the Arctic provoked a near immediate counter-reaction from Western Arctic states and especially the Trump administration in 2019. And this American hostility and Western hostility more generally to China's Arctic ambitions created a dilemma for Russia at the time, because of Western sanctions, the implementation of Russia's Arctic development plans depended exclusively on the continued goodwill of Chinese investors. Russia was prepared to tolerate the Chinese advances in the Arctic in return for economic support, but Russia also still wanted at the time to shield relations between the Arctic states from larger international disputes, which it couldn't quite square with the American opposition, especially to China's growing role in the region that Russia had facilitated. So Russia attempted to keep China's Arctic involvement at bay for some years. Therefore, I think that in the period before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, it would have been incorrect to speak of an Arctic alliance between Russia and China. I think that much rather the two countries had established a tacit and somewhat limited regional entente. And importantly, the limitations of that entente also set the stage for what happened after the invasion of Ukraine, when the Western Arctic states suspended almost all institutional cooperation with Russia. Which is that since 2022, China's relative, if not its absolute, economic involvement in Russia's Arctic territories declined. This does not mean at all that Chinese companies stopped investing in the region, but that they did not invest at a level that would have proportionately corresponded to what China did after 2014. And more importantly, Chinese companies did not step in to fill any of the major financing gaps that were left by the exit of Western companies from the Russian Arctic in 2022. To the contrary, Chinese stakeholders in Arctic LNG 2 departed their project on force majeure grounds in 2023, at the same time as French and Japanese stakeholders, and for the same reason, fear of secondary US sanctions. And although suppliers from China did fill some of the technology gaps of Russian Arctic energy projects, so did companies from other states, including Turkey and the United Arab Emirates. And I think that there were three major reasons for China's hesitancy to become even more involved in Russian Arctic after 2022. First one is an economic slowdown in China after COVID-19. There's just been much less money coming out of Chinese boardrooms for foreign investments in the last 2 years. Second, saturation of China's natural gas demand. China doesn't need to further diversify its range of gas suppliers at the moment, and even experience an oversupply of pipeline gas and therefore a slowdown of consumption during the pandemic. And third, a negative reassessment by the Chinese authorities of the political risk of doing business in Russia. In March 2022, according to intelligence reports, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs even instructed the country's 3 largest energy conglomerates to reassess their Russia business and reconsider potential acquisitions due to political risks. So with China not stepping up for a second time in 2022 to aid businesses in the Russian Arctic, what did Russia do, considering the importance of the Arctic for its economic well-being? It reached out to countries in the so-called global south, mostly to find new customers for Arctic oil and gas, but also for investments and scientific cooperation. For example, in the course of 2022, Russia sold much of its Arctic crude oil to India and Turkey. We've already heard a lot about that today. And in some cases, actually at huge discounts, especially for India. Russia tried to attract new investments for Arctic energy projects from India, Azerbaijan, and Vietnam. In terms of Arctic governance and political cooperation, most attendees of Arctic-related events that were held in Russia during the 2021 to 2023 chairmanship of the Arctic Council, the Russian chairmanship of the Arctic Council, came from non-Western and non-Arctic states. And in terms of scientific cooperation, Russia announced plans for the construction of a new research station on the Svalbard archipelago in cooperation with the BRICS states. It invited multiple Vietnamese ministries to participate in scientific, naval, and economic projects in the Arctic. And it also boosted Arctic cooperation with technology and logistics companies from the UAE. And of course, this economic and diplomatic turn by Russia towards a much broader range of Arctic partners has had huge symbolic and political consequences. For example, Russia has been less receptive than expected to efforts by Norway, which currently holds the rotating Arctic Council presidency, to cautiously resume some cooperation among the Arctic states. Whereas in its rhetoric, at least, Russia has been very enthusiastic about the participation of non-Arctic states and especially India in regional affairs. So on balance, I think what we're seeing at the moment is a decision by Russia to pivot away from the West in the Arctic, to keep up its good relations with China in the region, but also to kick the door of the Arctic wide open to other third states, especially if those states come with money to invest or thirst for Russian resources. Where that leads the Arctic governance system or environment is a little difficult to predict. But it is likely that Russia will use its Arctic relations with India and China as leverage to extract concessions from the remaining Arctic states by threatening to quit the Arctic Club entirely and to start something new with Beijing and New Delhi instead. And this is roughly where I want to conclude, unless I have another 30 seconds or so to add. Brilliant. Okay, good. This is just briefly about my current research project that I'm working on, which is going to be on Russia-India relations in the Arctic, which is kind of a bit of a nascent topic. But from a review of the Russian language literature on India's role in the Arctic, I learned that, of course, for the energy industry in Russia, India is extremely important because it's already the world's 3rd largest consumer of hydrocarbons, and its demand will grow until 2050, whereas China and the EU are expected to aim for carbon neutrality by, at the very latest, the middle of the century. But more importantly, and this is what I'd like to end on, and it's an uncomfortable glimpse into our collective future, China has an interest in Arctic food production. India has an interest in Arctic food production. And the way that's supposed to work is that India is one of the biggest agricultural producers in the world, but 196 million Indians approximately suffer from malnutrition and food insecurity today. And 40% of India's water supplies are groundwater, and that's a disappearing resource because of climate change. And 10 to 20% of Russian Arctic lands may become arable and usable for agriculture. So there are talks ongoing, have been talks ongoing between the two countries since 2019 to implement special migration regimes and send Indian laborers to Russia and try to use these Arctic territories for food production. So a lot's happening in the region, and maybe we can discuss if you have questions, any of this in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Lukasz. And now the floor goes to Raushan Jandaeva, the George Washington University.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Raushan. I'm a PhD student at George Washington University. Today, I will be presenting an early draft of one of my chapters for the dissertation. So any suggestions are welcome. So to sort of start and frame my research question. It comes from a simple acknowledgement that public diplomacy is an important mechanism of influence, and that it especially matters during international crisis, because that's when the public watches, and that's when the public keeps an eye on what's going on in the world. And those crises often are sort of accompanied by competing narratives from different actors. And the sort of the ongoing war in Ukraine provides an important case for us to study these competing narratives. So in the end, sort of my questions narrow down to what are the main topics that Russian and Western state-affiliated media covered in the last 2 years? How prevalent are certain topics over others? How does topic prevalence vary across narratives and time, as well as which topics tend to occur together? Here I would like to know that I acknowledge that there are multiple narratives besides Russian and Western, and I tend to aggregate Western narratives together. I also don't analyze Ukrainian narratives. I do realize that it's important and it's worthwhile, but it's a part of the dissertation where I'm going to test the effectiveness of those narratives in countries in Central Asia, in Caucasus. So I tended to concentrate on the narratives that are predominant in those countries. In terms of data, I was able to assemble an original corpus of news articles in Russian from January 2022 to December 2023. The articles were either web scraped directly from the website or through the database. Again, focusing on the following Western media, Western state-affiliated media, I should say, BBC, Euronews, Radio Liberty, and Current Time, as well as Russian media. For now, I just have RT, but I'm also in the process of data collection for RCID and Channel One. I do understand that those state channels are primarily aimed at domestic consumption, but they do have a lot of influence in Central Asia and in Caucasus. So for that reason, I'm including them into my data set. For this moment, at this moment, I have more than 100,000 articles. And as you can tell, like the majority of them, the predominant majority of them, more than like 60% come from Russia Today, which is not surprising, being like a part of the war essentially. But nonetheless, if you see the last column there, you can tell that while Russia Today sort of bombards us with the news tends to be much shorter. So on average, the news, like an article is about 100 words, whereas BBC article is on average about 1,000 words. So that tells us that sort of RT tends to publish a lot, but the articles are much shorter, sort of probably aiming to gain people's attention. That's sort of, that graph just confirms what I just said, that at any given point, and especially during the start of the war, we can see that RT published a lot. For my methods, I'm sort of trying to do topic modeling using structural topic modeling, which is allows me to sort of incorporate covariates, document level covariates, and my model is pretty simple. It's just an interaction between narrative, which was coded either as 1 or 0. It's a binary variable, as well as days, which is a continuous variable that sort of just shows us the day was 0, signifying the start of the war. Since this is just an exploratory analysis, I'm choosing n as 15, so number of topics is 15 for now, but this is definitely in the beginning. It's the beginning of the project, so this might change. In terms of topics, so those topics were labeled by me based on the words with highest probability, as well as frequency exclusivity. And as you can see, those topics include both sort of domestic affairs as well as international ones. For the sake of the future, like subsequent analysis, I'm also excluding 3 of those topics connected to art, connected to sports, as well as connected to other global events, just based on the articles where those topics were more predominant. They were not
from my analysis, they were not related to the war. When it comes to topic prevalence, the three most common topics, so those that exceed 10% of all the corpus were connected to diplomacy. So sort of, again, indicating this international dimension of the war, Western aid to Ukraine, as well as Russian military success, which is probably not surprising given how much RT posted on average every day. The least prevalent topics are, again, other global events, which is not surprising because I was primarily concentrating on Ukraine, art, as well as humanitarian crisis. When we compare overall the narratives produced by Western sources, and in this case, RT, during these 2 years, we can see that sort of Russian narrative concentrated more on Western aid to Ukraine, which is surprising. So it kind of shows again that sort of RT at least is wants to portray the war as this not the war against the sovereign nation, but rather this proxy war between Russia and the West. Russian narrative tend to emphasize Russian military success, unsurprisingly, as well as Ukrainian strikes in eastern Ukraine, like attack on eastern parts of Ukraine by Ukraine, as well as diplomatic efforts. Western narratives on the contrary, concentrated more on domestic politics of Russia. We can see here the prosecution of anti-war activists and politicians, Russian army losses, as well as mobilization, as well as obviously sanctions. However, at the same time, Western narratives are also concentrated more on sort of humanitarian crisis, as well as Ukrainian counteroffensive. And here it's important to know that there is definitely a difference in topic in terms of Ukrainian counteroffensive and Ukrainian strikes in eastern Ukraine, whereas one is clearly is about Ukraine, is a topic where it is framed as Ukraine defending itself. Ukrainian strikes in eastern Ukraine is more about the way that Russian media portrays like Ukraine is attacking its eastern territories. When I then went to talk about the prevalence over time, as you can see here, again, when it comes to Western aid to Ukraine, Russia tended to talk about it much more. There are definitely spikes and highs and lows here, but especially at the end of 2022 and then fall of 2023. We can also see, again, mentioning the Ukrainian strikes, that the RT covered it, especially in the beginning of the war. So like right around when the war started, probably sort of to justify special military operation or the war. Whereas Western, there's no Western coverage of it at all. Same with Russian military success, and it tended only to grow. Where RT, Western media sort of does not cover it at all. We can see a similar picture with humanitarian crisis, but the other way around, where Western media tended to cover it a lot, especially in the beginning of the war, reaching 15%. But then it sort of decreased, but Russian RT, again, Russian media did not cover it. When it comes to Ukraine counteroffensive, it sort of started, both Russian and Western media covered it to like a similar degree, but then it sort of diverged somewhere in, I would say summer of 2022, where Western media started talking a bit about it much more. Not surprisingly, Russian army losses mobilization. Western media talks about it pretty consistently, about 10% throughout those 2 years. And then prosecution of anti-war activists and politicians, also pretty small, around 5%, I would say around 2.5%, but most of it is covered by Western sources. Sanctions as well, most of it, again, covered by Western sources, and thank you. And again, most of it is in the beginning of the war, again, to sort of frame Russian aggression. When it comes to topics, relationships, so which topics tend to occur together, we can sort of see three clusters emerging. The first one is definitely role of Western nation, or like the international dimension of the conflict. The second one is about domestic consequences of the war, both in Ukraine and Russia. And the third one is battlefront dynamics in Ukraine. So those are the three main sort of clusters of topics that media tended to cover. So my next steps kind of include both methodological expansion as well as further data collection, but any suggestions in terms of theory and empirics would be really appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raushan. And now, Mark, please. Mark is from George Mason University.
Right. Right. Thank you very much. And I apologize in advance. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. I guess I should just plead old age. But I think it's not, just, I guess, from a generation, just doesn't do that anyway. What I want to talk about today is what underlies Moscow's good relations with the US's Middle Eastern partners in the Ukraine war. I think what we've seen is ever since the beginning of the war, Russia's main partners in the Middle East, Iran and Syria, have largely supported Russia and Russia's efforts, especially the Iranians sending drones, other forms of support. And that's not particularly surprising. What I think has been surprising is that America's longtime allies and partners in the Middle East, as well as others, have largely not joined the US and its Western allies, either in supporting Ukraine or sanctioning Russia. This is clearly not the policy toward the Russian invasion of Ukraine that Washington, Kiev, Brussels, and other Western capitals had hoped to see from the US's Middle Eastern partners, such as the Gulf Arabs, Egypt, Jordan, Turkey, even Israel, all of whom the West has been cooperating with, supporting, and even defending for several decades. And so the question is, why has this occurred? And basically, I think there are two reasons. One has to do with the success of Vladimir Putin's Middle Eastern diplomacy, in the decades prior to the war, which he has pursued ever since he first came to power. This has been aimed not just at improving Russian ties with anti-Western regimes in the region, as the Soviets did, but with traditionally pro-Western ones as well. And the other is the nexus of reinforcing considerations resulting in the US's Middle Eastern partners concluding that it is not in their interests to join America and the West in supporting Ukraine or sanctioning Russia. And indeed, that doing so could well be harmful to their interests. Now, I don't want to talk too much here about the first set of factors, the Putin's diplomatic outreach to the Middle East. I've written an awful lot about this over the past couple of decades, but it really was, ever since he first came to power, he's pursued this assiduously, that he's basically sought to have good relations with each and every major actor in the region, with everyone except for the jihadists, and they don't seem to want good relations with anyone else. But that Putin has done this, and that part of the reason is that when he first came into power, what they were interested in Russia was to prevent the Middle East from getting further involved in the Chechen conflict. They wanted to get investment from the Middle East into Russia. They wanted to have trade opportunities. And these were basically mainly available from the traditionally pro-Western governments, not so much the anti-Western governments, although this shouldn't be ignored either. And he basically did it. In other words, by the time of the Arab Spring, Putin did have good relations with each and every government. I think also part of the factor was that they very well learned the lesson of what happened during the 1967 war, when the Soviets broke diplomatic relations with Israel, a move that was very popular at the time in the Arab and Muslim world. But when it came time to the, Egypt in particular, deciding that they weren't going to defeat Israel militarily, they needed to have some kind of diplomatic solution. Soviet Union just wasn't very useful in that it didn't speak with Israel, whereas the United States was useful. And so we saw, much to Moscow's annoyance, that Washington dominated the conflict resolution process in the Middle East, such as it was for decades. And basically what's happened under Putin is that they see themselves as now trading places with the US in terms of Middle East diplomacy. That it's Russia that can talk with everyone, including all pro-Western partners, whereas the United States, which won't talk to certain parties. Therefore, it's Russia that should be in the position to help bring about these agreements. Now, of course, that alone isn't sufficient, but it is a powerful means of diplomatic entree that Russia can talk with everyone. Certainly during the Arab Spring itself, there was a very confusing situation but in general, there was Russia, tried to sort of accommodate to it at first in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Yemen. But then, of course, when it moved into Libya, into Syria, they were opposed to it. And basically, Russia came out of this also sort of portraying itself as the opposite of the United States. Whereas during the Cold War, the Soviet Union was the revolutionary power that sought to undermine existing governments, and the US sought to defend them. Now was the opposite. It was the United States that, through its policy of promoting democratization, as articulated by George W. Bush, his speech to the National Endowment for Democracy in, I think it was 2002, calling for the democratization of the region, whereas Russia was the defender of the authoritarian status quo of order, because all America's support for democratization led to was disorder. So by the time that the conflict in Ukraine occurred, that Russia had some advantages. And even those countries that were not happy that Russia intervened on behalf of the Assad regime in Syria, in fact, governments that were actively trying to overthrow it, that there developed sort of a narrative that Russia was to be respected. Putin defended his allies, unlike the United States, who abandoned its allies, Mubarak in particular. And so this was something that also sort of made Russia appear as a partner. But I think also, with regard to the war in Ukraine itself, each Middle Eastern government has had its own individual reasons for not joining the West and supporting Ukraine or sanctioning Russia, nor has there been a complete uniformity in their policies. Turkey, for example, has sold armed drones to Ukraine, but has not joined in Western sanctions against Russia. There appear, though, only to be a handful of motives for why America's Middle Eastern partners have generally not supported Ukraine or sanctioned Russia. One of these has to do with a generalized resentment over what public and elite opinion in Muslim countries of the Middle East view as American and Western double standards. There's a general resentment that while the US has criticized Russia for all the damage caused by its intervention in Ukraine, American-led intervention in Afghanistan and Iraq also obviously caused substantial damage. In Gulf Arab countries, there is a resentment about how the US has, in their view, done much more to help Ukraine fend off Russia than to help them fend off Iran and its various Shia militia allies. There's also resentment in Arab and Muslim worlds that while the US has acted to reverse Russian occupation of Ukrainian territory, it has not acted to reverse Israeli occupation of the West Bank, isolation of Gaza in the past, a resentment which has been aggravated by the high level of Palestinian civilian casualties in Gaza resulting from Israel's military campaign there. So public opinion, of course, does not determine how authoritarian or illiberal democratic Middle Eastern governments formulate foreign policy. For example, the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco all signed the Abraham Accords, normalizing relations with Israel. These were not popular in these countries. These Arab governments signed and observed them anyway, as the US had been urging them to do. As public opinion in the Middle East is generally not pushing the US's Middle Eastern partners to join America and the West when it comes to Ukraine and Russia, decisions by America's Middle East allies not to do so are actually more in line with public opinion in their countries. But in Israel, where there's genuine public sympathy for Ukraine and dismay about Russia, Various prime ministers in office since the start of the Russia-Ukraine war have also adopted policies similar to the Middle East norm of not aiding Ukraine or sanctioning Russia for realpolitik reasons, which Israeli public opinion show the Israeli public is understanding of. A more concrete reason for America's Middle Eastern partners not to abide by Western economic sanctions against Russia is that this has been quite profitable for them not to do. Turkey and the UAE in particular have benefited from Russia using them as alternative trade routes with Western countries with which direct bilateral trade has been ended or curtailed. Wealthy Russians seeking to avoid Western sanctions have also moved to their assets to, or move themselves to Turkey and the UAE, as we learned this morning, in particular, among other countries. Most important OPEC producer, Saudi Arabia, chose not to increase oil exports as the Biden administration requested to prevent the cutback of Western petroleum purchases from Russia, leading to higher energy prices for Western consumers. Instead, Saudi Arabia has cooperated with Russia in the OPEC plus format to reduce oil exports in order to support oil prices, a policy that's also benefited all other Middle Eastern oil producers, including Iran. Another reason for the US's Middle Eastern partners to not join the West in aiding Ukraine and sanctioning Russia is concern about how Moscow might retaliate against them if they do. Middle Eastern states fearing Iran do not want Moscow to increase its support for Tehran's ability to threaten them. Israeli officials have cited their desire to preserve the Russian-Israeli deconfliction agreement regarding Syria. Israel does not want Russia to stop turning a blind eye to Israeli attacks and start helping Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah war them off or retaliate in kind. Israeli officials have also cited their fear that overt Israeli support for Ukraine could result in the Kremlin adopting policies harmful to the Russian Jewish community, including preventing it from emigrating to Israel. Gulf Arab states also want to avoid actions that result in Moscow increasing its cooperation with Iran. The grain import question as well, although that was more an issue toward the beginning of the war, and now both Russian and Ukrainian grain seem to be getting to market. That obviously, as we saw at the beginning of the war, that a lot of poor Middle Eastern countries are very dependent on Black Sea grain shipments. If these are interrupted, this could lead to problems in those countries, problems which will spill over 2 minutes, right? Almost there. And so this is something they don't want. In other words, they just want the war to end and the security of grain exports to be secure. Finally, leaders in the U.S.'s Middle Eastern partner countries appear to share a geopolitical perspective closer to that of Moscow than that of Washington and Brussels. Key elements of this perspective is that the U.S.-dominated unipolar world order has ended and a multipolar one has come into being. That the new multipolar world order provides opportunities for regional powers to take advantage of, and that U.S. and Western criticism of authoritarian governments in the Middle East undermine the stability that America's Middle Eastern partners see themselves as providing for the region, and which Moscow and Beijing are appreciative of. Indeed, the U.S.'s Middle Eastern partners are cooperating with Russia and China as a way to make Western governments understand that Middle Eastern governments have other great powers they can turn to. In fact, they seem to fear that a Russian defeat in Ukraine could result in a resurgence of the West and all its unwelcome demands about democracy and human rights. In conclusion, both Putin's successful diplomatic outreach to them and the mutually reinforcing concerns and calculations about their own interests have resulted in America's longtime partners in the Middle East being generally unwilling to support Ukraine or sanction Russia ever since the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war, nor will the possibility that U.S. support for Ukraine might decline as a result of rising Republican opposition going to encourage America's Middle Eastern partners to become more sympathetic to Ukraine or hostile to Russia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?